What's up, everybody? Welcome to another installment of That Science and Nature Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Howard, and joining me this week, we have Sebastian Forward.
Hello, everyone.
Becky Hanses-O'Neill.
Hey.
And Andreia.
Hello.
This week, we're going to have lots of fun aquatic-based articles. So we're going to be talking about seaweed, we're going to be talking about fossils, and we're going to be talking about octopi. And then for our topic of the show, we're going to get a little bit into wildlife photography and wildlife media and all the fun components with that. But starting us off today with our first article, talking all about this phenomenon known as the Sargassum Belt, which is basically this giant 5,000-mile-long pile of seaweed. And this comes to us from NPR. The whole article title is Meet the Sargassum Belt, a 5,000-mile-long snake of seaweed circling Florida. So basically the report is talking all about how on the Florida coast, there's basically this giant pile of seaweed washing ashore. And the easiest way to describe it is a bunch of sopping, rotten algae and seaweed just kind of piling up and becoming very gross and very smelly. And I don't know about you guys, but I have never actually witnessed seaweed in this capacity on the beach. Have any of you?
I've seen them in much significantly smaller mounds, so they're just like floating kind of on the water. But I didn't know they could be this huge and the amount of problems that they could cause.
One of the things they mentioned is when the algae builds up, not only is it kind of a nuisance because they've got these pictures of entire beaches just covered with like several feet thick piles of algae. It actually turns really somewhat dangerous when it breaks down because when it decomposes, it releases like poisonous gases that will actually make you sick if you're on the beach or trying to clean it up or, you know, in the local vicinity. So it's not only an inconvenience, it's actually also a health hazard.
Yeah, so in the article they mentioned that after like 48 hours, once it starts to rot, it's going to release hydrogen sulfide. So it's going to smell like rotten eggs on that beach.
Yeah, so not only does it smell god-awful, it has created a lot of problems for tourism. So obviously no one wants to come on the beach when there's a giant pile of disgusting seaweed that's kind of rotting and smelling awful and preventing you from, you know, going in the water and having fun and sunbathing and all that good stuff.
It seems like it's all pretty good if it stays out in the ocean. It can act as a carbon sink, habitat, though there's some suggestions here that it's been supplemented by essentially agricultural runoff, so maybe it's bigger than it used to be. But it seems like the big issue is when it comes and gets on the beach. So don't be freaked out about the seaweed just being out in the ocean, I guess, is my point.
A part of, you know, kind of the reason this is an issue is a thing called eutrophication. It's a fancy word for basically whenever we fertilize our crops, we dump a whole bunch of fertilizer on it, and a lot of that ends up just kind of washing off the soil into, you know, small rivers, and eventually all of that ends up, you know, the place where rivers go is the ocean. And when it ends up there, it basically just fertilizes the algae. So we've given, you know, a whole bunch of food to these plants, and they do what plants are very good at, which is like multiplying rapidly. And that's why we kind of have this problem. It is our fault when you get down to it. But it's, you know, definitely the algae doing some inconvenient things on coastlines.
Yeah, so like with a lot of these issues that are, you know, the cause can definitely be, we are the cause, right? As humans, you know, interrupting these nitrogen cycles. And so over time that they've seen that this sargassum problem has gotten worse and worse and worse. So it interrupts local economies. You know, they have to shut down like tourist beaches, marinas, you know, fishing declines on which some communities depend.
It's kind of hard to go fishing when your entire fishing area is filled with like thousands of pounds of seaweed.
Or try boating through that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so it's a huge issue, right? And also the predictions of where it's going to end up, it's hard to predict, right?
Yeah, it seems like from the article that this is not despite the title being Florida, this is not a Florida-specific problem. This is kind of an everywhere-specific problem where it doesn't necessarily matter where you live. If there's lots of runoff from fertilizer, like Sebastian was mentioning, you will eventually see this build up.
Things like this can also happen in river systems, just like ours here in Missouri. You can have harmful algae blooms. They call them like HABs for that, and they will make river water poisonous when they happen. Normally in the peak of summer when things get really hot and the algae bloom there. So
Yeah, even when these fertilizers don't result in toxicity, they fundamentally change the food web in freshwater ecosystems. So if there's macroinvertebrates, so that's just a fancy word for little bugs that live in the stream. If you're a fly fisherman or fly fisher woman person, you know their life cycles a bit. They hatch, they fly around, get eaten by fish. But if there's more algae or anything supplemented that is a food source for one of those bugs and not the other, you can get this artificial increase in certain bugs. And depending on the ecosystem, that can be kind of a big deal.
Yeah, I think the thing that was the largest eyebrow raise for me was when it said, following last year's record sargassum levels, the U.S. Virgin Islands declared a state of emergency because of how much there was. That to me is terrifying and hilarious. Like, you had to shut things down because there's just too much seaweed everywhere.
a national emergency. Yep. That's
that.
I suppose that's how it is when your economy is directly related to the amount of people who can come and enjoy your beaches.
Yes, indeed. Any last thoughts on seaweed and it piling up on the beaches?
I'm glad that we don't live right there,
Yes.
at least. Yeah.
In Missouri, we're safe from the seaweed.
Yes.
Though, good point the article makes is that the Mississippi does dispense into that, so we do cause that indirectly.
Yeah,
That's
so
fair.
I was going to say, in terms of like, cleaning up the messes is just kind of, attacking the symptoms, right? We need to, clean up rivers, change agricultural practices at a much larger scale to start to see any effect on these sort of issues.
Right. Cool. Our second article today comes from Live Science, and the title here is, bear with me, it's a little long. It's, Oops, this 300-million-year-old blob fossil was upside down. It's not a jellyfish after all. So this sounds like a complicated scenario here. The crux of the story is basically this. Some scientists found a fossil. They thought it was a jellyfish, and basically some other scientists took a look at it a little while later, and they realized it was simply a sea anemone just flipped upside down, which... At its crux, this is a very simple haha, but I kind of want to talk about it because it's just so weird that this is a news story.
Did you see any pictures of the fossil? Did you click on them?
Oh, I didn't even click on them.
Yeah, so it looks like a jellyfish, kind of like if you were imagining a cartoon jellyfish. It's jellyfish-esque. There are hints of jellyfish, but it makes much more sense if you flip it and say it's a sea anemone, to my untrained eye.
Mm-hmm. This is definitely a problem for things in paleontology. Basically, when all you have to work on is what it kind of looks like, and when what it looks like is definitely a blob. It's a very very special shaped blob, but you can. There are a lot of ways to interpret what does this blob mean, and unless you really dive into the details, you don't really ever find out if you're right or wrong.
Well, I think it's a bit of priming too, right? The fossil, you can't really see it all that well, right? You kind of get these glints of the outlining, it's not a clear image of what the organism is, right? You're working with kind of a fragmented stone that's been worn down over millions of years. So I think it's something about priming too, right? Someone comes in and says, this is the way that we look at it, this is what it is. Sure. And so it is this aha moment where the other scientist came in and says, wait, this is not a jellyfish.
Yes.
Let's turn it around. So they just turn it upside down. It's like, oh, okay, I can see that too.
This is not the first time that this has happened with paleontology. There's some things in the Burgess Shale I've heard about where they thought they had a worm, and they're like, we've got this really cool worm, and turns out it was like a a part of the face of a totally different animal, and like they have two of them, so it's basically like one of their little mouth parts there. When it breaks off, it looks like a totally different thing, and when you don't know what it is at all, you can make some pretty incorrect guesses if you don't have enough data, which is why it's always best to base things off a large number of samples, and best to, I don't know, get multiple opinions.
Right, get multiple people to look at it. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of people thought these were jellyfish,
Yeah.
so I'm not sure that would have helped this particular instance, but.
I mean, I think as someone who sometimes looks through binoculars and sees a leaf that looks like a bird, I have no judgment.
Yes.
Mistakes happen.
Yeah, this article definitely makes sort of highlights that not all science is like rigid science. Like there's kind of an art to interpreting things, where it's like one person's perspective on something reveals this insight, and another person's perspective may reveal this additional insight, which may then allow the person one to go back and sort of retroactively change their insight. So I thought that was kind of a interesting take on that in a humorous kind of way. Mm-hmm. One thing I also wanted to bring up is when we think about science, typically we think about these sort of miraculous discoveries that someone worked really hard and, put two and two together and discovered this miraculous thing, where this is actually one of those examples where this kind of was just dumb luck. Do you think that's a big part of science, this dumb luck, this just happenstance of things? Or do we think it's more, there is a lot of rigor to it?
I think it's a little bit of both, because I think it's easy to take things like fossil identification for granted, especially on an invertebrate animal like this. So I think that there's a little bit hard work, you're going through the collections, and then a little bit of luck where someone says, you know what, I want to flip that upside down. I think it's actually kind of an indirect plug for making sure you have diverse teams in science and people that look at things in all different kinds of ways.
So what about like not fossil identification, even on a larger scale, like outside of even just biology or chemistry or physics or even just anything?
Oh, I don't know. What do you think?
I'll say one of my friends is an engineer, and he told me this story that is told amongst engineering circles, that in the early days of like Mars rovers and stuff like that, they were trying to engineer a light bulb to put on the rover or on one of these spacecraft, and they it's kind of fragile, and it kept breaking, and they're having so many troubles designing these light bulbs, and they put millions of dollars into trying to figure it out. I don't know if that's actually true, but they tried to solve this problem, and then one day there was a different engineer. There was a different engineer who realized that the reason why you put a light bulb around something is to keep the air out, and in space you don't have air, so you don't need a light bulb. And his thing was that every engineer shouldn't be the one to make an indestructible light bulb. They should be the one to realize that they don't need it in the first place.
Interesting, yeah.
I kind of want them to make an indestructible light bulb anyway, just because that sounds cool.
Fair enough.
That's awesome. Alrighty. So our third and final article for the hour comes to us from BBC News. And this, again, is kind of fitting our aquatic theme. This is the world's first octopus farm proposal alarms scientist. So basically, the article crux is this, that scientists are sort of finagling with ways to create an environment to rear octopi for human consumption. So we obviously have this in things like agriculture with livestock, where we have, mass chicken farms for eating chicken and cows and et cetera, et cetera. But for aquaculture, which is basically just like aquatic farming, like octopi, fish, all that stuff, this is a little more of a tricky topic because the conditions to raise an octopi are a lot more difficult than something like a chicken or a cow. And this one, I believe it's a company, Nueva Pesca Nova, is basically sort of believes they sort of cracked the code to getting the conditions right for octopi farming. However, the counterpoint, a lot of animal welfare people are going against this, saying that this is not necessarily humane. this should not be a step forward that we take with aquaculture, and so on and so forth. So kind of not inviting controversy, but saying there's a lot more to this than just we should make an octopus farm, which my first thought was, we don't already have this? I thought we already had this. I didn't know this was news, actually.
I know that, the difficulties of taking care of these animals are, that's why this is really new. And I think if it were easier, we probably wouldn't be talking about this right now, because we farm all sorts of other stuff, and I do have my opinion on this, and it's that we don't decide what to eat based on how smart it is. We eat pigs, and pigs are smarter than dogs and 3-year-old humans, and I think that whether or not you eat something doesn't necessarily, change just because it's smart, I guess. It's not like I don't know. I'm not entirely sure that we should be eating pigs, but I don't think octopi necessarily get away scot-free, or like we can't farm them, because we still eat octopi, even though they're very smart. So
right.
I feel like this is drawing artificial distinctions where, you could argue if it's okay to eat octopi, but we're not really having that discussion. We're just having the farming part of it. So.
Well, I think it is different, and I think the point might be like, how, well, one, farming octopuses now is like in a different world, I guess, when pigs and chickens started to be farmed. But also there's been a lot more progress on the end of things that we already farm, animals that we already farm, like chickens, right? So there is a difference in the conditions that chickens can be kept, and you can choose to buy, like free-range chickens, right? Things that affect their lifestyle up until the moment that you kill them for food, right? And I think that's something that is important to consider with octopuses, right? How they're killed. So they're iced, and this is considered kind of a cruel, slow, torturous death. So maybe thinking about a different way to kill them is one thing to look at.
Yeah, the article mentions the more humane way to kill an octopi is to club it over the head, which I didn't think was necessarily more humane. But
Sounds cruel, but
Well,
might be faster.
given how their nervous systems work, they're a little bit more distributed. So yeah, they have a brain. There is cephalization, so that means concentration of like sensory processing in the head. But there's also a lot more going on in their limbs and things. So you can't necessarily guarantee a humane death via a clunk on the head either.
Yeah, it's a not very pleasant subject that I think my opinion of this is people will figure out the most efficient and like probably best way to kill the octopi. I find that to be a somewhat secondary point, that this article spends a long time talking about like how the octopi die, but I feel like if you can raise them, and I guess we really don't know that much about the welfare of octopi, or
Oh, that's kind of a whole big research area that's just exploded in, I'd say, the past 5 to 8 years. So there are countries that have regulations for them that other invertebrates don't have. So I think that's part of the reason why there's kind of a backlash here, is because that welfare research has taken off. People very much think that they have the capacity to suffer. So I think that's why this is even on the table as a discussion.
That's fair. I thought there's another aspect to this. When I first read this, I was like, cool, we can farm octopi and stop like collecting them from the wild and overfishing them, which was my first reaction, and that's kind of my optimistic take, just because I think I prioritize the like natural, the organisms in their natural environment, I think matter more than like the ones that we keep for food. So I think if we could farm these well enough to reduce pressure on wild ecosystems, then I think that would be a beneficial outcome overall.
So, do you all eat seafood or octopi, or we'll just start with seafood at large? Are you guys seafood eaters?
Yes.
Yep, I enjoy seafood. Octopus is not my favorite. I've tried it.
Same. I prefer fish. in general.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, not a huge fan.
Okay. Yeah, I've tried octopi. It's kind of whatever. I'm more like Andreia, I like fish. Does this article change your perspective on your seafood eating habits at all, or does it kind of like shoulder shrug?
I don't know. I think it's a complicated question, and I mean, I agree with Sebastian in terms of, yeah, absolutely domesticating them. You might take that pressure off of wild populations, which are affected. But I mean, we eat a lot of octopus, so we do take them from the wild quite significantly. I do think it's also important to be rigorous about the way that it's done, especially if it's the first time that it's going to be done. So, for example, this is like one company, and it says, the plans state that the company says that they've achieved a level of domestication in the species. So they're not going to cannibalize or compete for food, supposedly. The company says this, again, I think with science, the company clearly has interest in domesticating the species. So I think it would be important for other scientists to also look into this, to see, what do they mean by they have some level of domestication? What does this mean for their welfare in contained habitats?
I also agree. I think I want for this to happen, and I want to see how it goes. Like I'm curious as to like if this works. If they can actually farm them, then we could have people figure out if it's a good idea. Someone could do the research on whether or not it necessarily works, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm not sure it changes my fundamental approach to seafood eating either. I definitely have some mixed feelings, but in addition to, like I said, octopus welfare research coming out, there's been a lot more fish research in the past decade as well, in terms of fish farming and the capacity for fish to suffer. And that's not necessarily correlated with how smart, in quotes, an organism is. So I don't know, whenever we're mass farming anything, there's going to be some suffering. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm with Andreia on this one. Like, let's see what happens and let's get some scientists in there.
Yeah, and I will say, mass farming also has its ecological footprint as well, right? Like the waste, sometimes the destruction of habitat to make these farms as well.
Yeah, where are they going to dump the waste from all these octopi that are going to be in these tanks?
Into the Sargassum Belt, of course.
Fair.
Yeah, I think I need more details before making a judgment. They do say that, with all this waste that the octopuses produce, they'll be filtered, so they'll have no impact on the environment. I find that kind of just hard to believe offhand, like no impact. I don't know.
Yeah.
Some level of impact it will have.
I think my thing is we're realizing the harmful impacts of industrial agriculture, nowadays. But that doesn't make it any less important that we do industrial agriculture. Like we kind of need to do these things to survive. We don't necessarily have to eat octopi to survive, or that is entirely up for debate, and how important that should be. But every item of food we eat has a negative impact on the world. Pretty much, it's just a matter of extremity, and some things are better for the environment than others. So I guess it's kind of our responsibility to direct ourselves towards the better things. And
Correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't seafood have less of like a ecological footprint than like chickens and cows and stuff? Maybe, if I remember this correctly.
That's kind of complicated, I think.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
The short answer is, in general, fish farming can have really negative impacts locally. Like it can be really nasty.
It depends on the trophic level of the fish, too,
Yeah,
right? You have
exactly.
these like bigger predator fish, like tuna and salmon, is going to have a different impact versus tilapia.
Yeah. No, that is very true, and the average like CO2 emissions from fish is dramatically lower than at least beef and pork, I believe. But chickens Chickens are pretty good. I'm a big advocate for chickens as far as environmental stuff because they are very good at making more chickens and they can do it fast and pretty efficiently. So
With seafood, I'm a little more worried about just straight up population decline of the things we're eating as opposed to carbon footprint. But I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's a really good point. I agree with you on that.
there is like more plastic in the ocean than fish at this point. So we do have to worry about, kind of wiping out the wild stocks of these things that we eat.
And just the regulations on over-harvesting fishing are a little more, lax, I guess, in some areas. Yeah.
We definitely mentioned this in the last episode about the high seas treaty that it's really hard to enforce like international fishing law.
Yeah.
Alrighty. That's going to wrap up the news, and now we're going to transition to topic of the show. So last week, there was a big award event, and that was the Oscars. We had lots of awards for movies given out, but that's not what we're going to focus on because there was another award show that was overlooked, and that was the British Wildlife Photography Awards. And obviously this takes place in the UK. And this involves contestants submitting photos to a number of categories. So things like animal behavior, botanical Britain, black and white, urban wildlife, coastal and marine, wildlife and video, documentary series, lots and lots of categories. And we wanted to use, for the topic of the show, wanted to use this as a jumping off point to talk about wildlife and photography, or even at a larger scale, wildlife and media. So the competition obviously has a lot of people submitting their photos, amateur photographers, professional photographers, all that stuff. Anyone who can get their hands on a good photo submits it. And talk about our experiences with wildlife photography, how wildlife photography at large kind of plays into natural history and preserving nature and interacting with nature and all of that. So in the best you can, because obviously we're an audio show, not a visual show, to start out, of the Wildlife British Photography Awards, what was your favorite? Describe it for the audience, if you will. I can start with mine, since I just launched the question. So there is a photo, and you can just Google British Wildlife Photography Awards 2023, and then it'll pull up the awards page, and you can scroll down and see all the photos. The photo I really liked is basically this carpenter bee, in its little hole, and it has this, it's a real close-up shot with a really very refined camera, and you kind of just see it kind of nesting in it. It looks very cute. It's very clear-faced. It doesn't look harmful. It just kind of looks like it's nesting and very solace. So that was my favorite. Did you guys have any favorites?
Yeah, I would say one that really stuck out to me is in the black and white category. So this one is titled Murmuration by Paula Cooper. And murmurations are these really cool social flocking behaviors that you can see in starlings. So you can see thousands of birds flocking together, and they create these really interesting patterns and shapes in the sky, and they're really quite something to look at. You can actually see them here in the United States because European starlings are an introduced invasive species. But this photo really stands out to me because I've seen lots of photos of murmurations, and they're always really spectacular, but they're never really as spectacular as being there and looking at the murmuration. And I like this one and the choice of black and white because in the photo there really is no space of sky. It's just totally covered in birds, and it goes from these dense, really dark birds to less dense to even less dense or maybe further away, so you get kind of this grayscale from black to lighter. And I really like it. It's really quite beautiful, and murmurations are really a spectacular behavior in nature.
How about you, Becky or Sebastian? You have a favorite?
Yeah, there's one called Amber Nesting by Daniel Trim, and it's a few birds. I don't know, maybe that's a wood thrush, I can't tell. But they're nesting in a stoplight, and the light is turned yellow right behind their nest, and I liked the juxtaposition of nature and an urban environment.
I see there's another one here, Urban Reflections by Simon Withyman, and it's of a fox foraging around on a polished granite sidewalk, and you can see, or maybe it's just wet, but you can see the reflection of the fox in the street as it's kind of scurrying around this little urban area.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of foxes. Pretty popular for photography. I wasn't expecting as many foxes. That's just my take.
If it is in Britain, that they don't have like that many species of like animal on the
Fair.
islands.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about our experiences with photography. So I will admit I have zero wildlife photography experience other than just taking pictures when I've been traveling. So like when I studied abroad in Australia, it was absolutely gorgeous. They have so much amazing wildlife there. I tried to take as many pictures as I could. They were not great photos, but I tried as best as I could to capture the nature that I did. Becky and Andrea, I know you guys have more experience with this. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I started nature photography, oh gosh, almost 10 years ago, because it was when I started dating my husband. Yeah, and I like to go around. I have a macro lens, telephoto lens, and I really, really love pollinators and bugs. That's kind of my thing right now. And then I always will go back to birds. Birds are amazing. I love photographing birds. And I've been lucky enough to have things published, or occasionally a nonprofit will ask to use something. So it's been a lot of fun. I love it because I can pick it up whenever I want and set it down whenever I need to. It's not a hobby I have to do all the time. And yeah, it's just a lot of fun.
Yeah, so I also do some photography on the side. I did not start with wildlife photography at all. I did more portraits or landscape photography. So this is like photography that you can really take your time with. And I actually started with film photography. So film photography is a lot slower, one, because you're paying for the cost of film, and each film is only going to have like 36 photos that you can take. So, you know,
You can't just take like 5,000.
You're more careful about the photos that you're taking with the film, exactly. And so when I started getting more into birds, naturally I was like, well, I want to start photographing these birds. And it was quite a challenge and a leap to start photographing these birds. We were talking about initially my photos were, blurry birds, or I have several beautiful photos of in focus branches where the bird used to be, but was no longer at the time of my shot. Yeah.
I'll say I've always kind of admired photography like a little bit from afar. I've wanted to get into it, but I'm also very scared of carrying around like a valuable camera. So I've always fortunately, as a botanist, the things I want to photograph don't run away, and you can get as close to the flowers as you need to in order to get the pictures. So I have managed thus far with a decent, camera phone. One of the all of the front runner smartphones nowadays have amazing cameras compared to, just any digital camera like 15 years ago is going to be beat by the thing that's probably in your pocket. So I know, not with birds, because birds are really hard to photograph. You can't really photograph birds very well with the smartphone. But if you're willing to go for things like landscapes or flowers or other things, you can definitely manage pretty well with a smartphone.
Absolutely. I mean, and there is a trade-off to going around hiking,
Yep.
carrying that equipment. It is heavy. Telephoto lens are heavy. You want to carry your camera, probably 2 lenses, maybe a tripod, all that, plus probably your binoculars or whatever other stuff, water bottle that you're using out there. So it is a trade-off. So sometimes I definitely lean towards not taking my camera and just going out with the binoculars. Sometimes I want to just go with my camera and really, practice birding by ear and really focus on my photography skills. Yeah.
Yeah, and the ruined equipment cost thing is no joke. A few years ago, my husband and I went to near Cancun in the Yucatan, and we managed to dump a camera body and a telephoto lens into a mangrove swamp. So that equipment was done.
Yeah, that's
Was this like a trip, drop the equipment, or was this just like you were going for a shot and like it fell out of your hands?
Well, we were kayaking in the mangrove swamp and started to notice there were crocodiles, and that became a little bit distracting. And then we had a little mishap with the kayak, so the camera and my husband were briefly in the water with the crocodiles.
Oh, that's terrifying.
But everyone was safe. It was fine. And yeah. So
Except for the camera.
Except for the camera, but it all's well that ends well. So no worries.
Rest in peace.
Yeah, strongly recommend a pack that's waterproof. I also fell in a kayak in non-crocodilian waters, but my binoculars did perish in the water.
Oh, no.
Not my camera, though. My camera was safe.
Nice.
I think, I think I can speak for all of us when I say that, wildlife, maybe not necessarily photography, but filmography is very much one of the leading reasons as to why I am, here today talking about nature stuff and, participating as a nature person. Growing up, Animal Planet was, my entire childhood, and, the products of people, carrying very, very, very expensive cameras out into very, very far away places to take videos of lions and butterflies and all of the things that end up in the nature documentaries. That's probably one of my biggest inspirations as a naturalist, if I'm being honest. How about you guys?
Wildlife, filmmaking and the visual media, non-photography visual media, is something I actually am interested in career-wise. So Becky knows this because I mentioned this from lab settings and stuff. But so when I was in high school, then college, and then part of after college, my friends and I did a bunch of sketch comedy videos where we would write sketches and film them and edit them and all that stuff. So I love the process of making a story and putting it together and filming it, all that stuff. And I love all of the wildlife components. I'm long term, I would be something I would like to look into in terms of how are wildlife documentaries made, what goes into them. Obviously, you don't just conjure them up out of nothing. You have to do research and find locations to film and go film them. And whenever I watch a documentary, I'm wow. Or back in the day when I was younger, I was wow, the mouse did all of these things in 2 minutes. I'm no, it's probably 12 hours of footage, and they got 2 minutes from that to use for the documentary.
Yeah, patience is key in photography, time and patience. Yeah, for me growing up, it also, I think, also had a huge impact. I don't remember seeing that many documentaries, but we would get the National Geographic magazines, and I would just spend hours looking at all those images. And as a child, I absolutely wanted to be a National Geographic photographer and travel the world and take photos of animals. But I also thought that it happened a lot faster.
Yep.
Yeah, I was definitely inspired by documentaries, and I still watch them all the time. It's one of my favorite things to watch. The most recent one from BBC, actually, was Frozen Planet. They had lots of... I was so pleased. They deviated from Antarctica and the Arctic, and we got to see some more, I don't know what I'd call it, Hall Arctic species, so it was really cool. And I've noticed for all these BBC Natural History Unit documentaries, there's always an episode at the end that's the making of, and you see all this miserable field work that the camera people and producers have to do. And I think to myself, I like going in the field sometimes. I don't want to sit in a hide full of mosquitoes with a little bucket to use the bathroom in for 24 hours straight with granola bars. No, thank you.
Yeah, that snow leopard picture exists because some dude sat there freezing his butt off for 20 days straight on a mountainside with a 4-foot long camera looking at a hill
Yeah,
the whole time. It is a truly amazing sacrifice.
One hesitation when I see that stuff. I'm yeah, maybe not.
I mean, there are opportunities for urban wildlife
That's
photography.
True.
That's true.
Yeah.
I think as a medium, nature photography is the way most people interact with nature. The way most people learn about, the amazing things in the world. I don't know about orangutans because I've seen them. I know because I've watched shows about them, and I think it goes a really long way to inspiring people and bringing people into the field. So, as far as biology propaganda goes, nature documentaries, nature filmography is my best friend.
So I kind of want to ask a question that we were talking about earlier. With photography being so accessible to so many people now, and wildlife, that kind of that intersection of wildlife and humans coexisting in the same spaces. I want to kind of ask you all what you think about like the ethics of photography. How close should you get to an animals? What should you do? Where that patience versus kind of intruding in their habitat and in their behavior. Like, what does this mean to you? What does ethics in photography mean to you?
Well, I cannot answer this entirely probably in the way you think I will, because I have not I have a camera and I'm going to specifically go to the habitat. What I have done before is use things like trail cams. So that's sort of I guess, reverse photography of sorts. So the way trail cams work, for those of you who haven't seen them or used them, is think of it as like a giant bulky camera that you're going to mount to like a tree or like a branch or something, and you're going to leave it there. Like, you're not going to be with the camera. The idea is that the trail cam has a lot of battery, so it can be there for days or months depending on what model you get. And the idea is eventually something's going to walk by and trigger it based on how large it is. And when you go get the trail cam, you can take out the SD card and look at all of the times it was triggered and see what was captured. Depending on how sensitive it was, it might have been like a deer walking by, it might be a squirrel, it might be a bird, it might be the wind blowing, and it just took a picture of the landscape. But you can kind of see all that stuff on the back end when you pull it out. And sometimes you can capture some really cool stuff, like at night, if there's like a specific animal that you were looking for, and it's rare. If the trail cam can take a bunch of photos, and you can parse out a couple. Something when I was doing, I researched bumblebees, and I had a trail cam pointed at a colony we found a couple summers ago, and one of the photos I was just going through was like a snake passed by, like underneath, and I was like, that was super cool. It wasn't related to my research, but that was a cool get, and I didn't intrude on the snake or the bumblebee colony per se, but it just sort of happened to capture it. So in that sense, that's the level of intrusion that I have committed. So that's as far as I can. That's my point of discussion for this.
Yeah, I haven't used a flash on owls or baited birds of prey or some of the more egregious things. But I was thinking about this, and I'm like, you know what? I don't always have those same rules for poor amphibians if it's nighttime. I've had a diffuser on my flash, but I've still used the flash. Depending on the local laws, there are certain insects or reptiles, amphibians you can handle, just depending on what's legal where you are. But the more I thought about it, the best photos I have with the best behavior are from animals that I was not interacting with, that I had a lens that allowed me to be pretty far away, and I wasn't intruding on them. And that's when I've really gotten the coolest stuff. So I think it's in our benefit to be a little more hands-off, even if I'm a little bit of a hypocrite.
Yeah, I guess to bring it back to my trail cam thing, because that better answers the question, Becky's point, by being less invasive, I was able to capture other cool stuff. So that's my angle.
I think, in my opinion, the worst crimes against nature that are committed related to photography are generally people taking photos of themselves with nature things. And in an essence, totally ignoring or destroying the nature thing that they're supposed to be appreciating. My example are, people trying to take selfies with bison and then, getting killed by the bison because they were 4 feet away and doing something stupid, or people trying to take pictures of beautiful fields of flowers by crushing the flowers and then laying on them, which is very insulting if you're thinking if your goal is to take a picture of the flowers. I think that is almost always a good thing that will be doing minimal harm if your goal is to use the flowers as a backdrop for your selfies. Then you are getting into the unethical territory.
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy to tell, in my opinion, when you're interrupting an animal there. Sometimes, with bird photography, you think, even with a telephoto lens, right? And maybe there's a songbird. Songbirds are tiny. They're flying around in the bushes. So you think, okay, I'll get a little bit closer. Just maybe one more step. Maybe I can get a better photo from this angle. But then there comes a point where the bird, is aware of your presence, feels intimidated, and then you flush it. It kind of takes off. And I think that's where you have to stop and be like, okay, you know what? I've disturbed this poor bird enough. Let me go. Okay.
Not chase the single bird through the forest.
Do not chase the bird through the forest.
I had a mishap this weekend photographing bees. tangentially related. So in this case, I had a native bee house, and I thought, okay, this set of cocoons from last year is not good. It looks kind of dried and crusty. I'm going to put it in my photo box, get some good educational pictures. And I thought I'm going to dissect one of these cocoons out really pretty and photograph this dead bee that's been mummified in here. Well, halfway through my dissection, it started buzzing, and then I realized, oh no. And then the bee crawled out of the cocoon, so I was chasing a bee around my desk. So this can take you to weird places if you're getting a little hands-on. So I caught the bee, gave it sugar water and some pollen, and let it go once it was warm in the morning. This is a very early season bee for people that are in Missouri. The species is starting to come out. But yeah, I let a live bee loose in my house.
Bee researchers are very entertaining. This is
can
something I have
confirm.
learned being adjacent to them in the department.
Did discover that the little mason bees also do what's called the defensive leg extension response. So all those cute videos you see of people giving bumblebees high fives, that's a defensive body language. That's kind of the bee bird or the bee finger. So mason bees do that too. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
So one last question as we wrap up, bringing it sort of back to the awards component of this that sort of kicked off our conversation. Is there a category of awards you would like to see created to elevate some aspect of wildlife or nature or landscapes that you don't see represented very well in photography?
Okay, I have one, but this is kind of, I thought of it and then realized it already exists. But so for birds, and this is a bias in research too, female birds tend to be understudied, and also they are not sought out after for photography because they're not as colorful. They tend to be, described as more drab, kind of brown, not these colorful patterns that their male counterpart have. And so I was thinking, in photographing birds, I would like to see specifically a category for just female birds. And actually, the Audubon Society that has a photography competition as well, they do have a category called female birds. And I think because of this bias as well, right? Because people tend to focus on the more colorful males than the females.
Don't neglect the boring birds.
Drab can be beautiful.
Yes.
My one thing was just going to be like underground stuff. That could be like moles, rats, insects, just stuff underground that we have no idea what it's like down there.
And more challenging to
And what,
photograph.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't say it was an easy category. I just said a category that was underrepresented.
Man, you're making it tough on these photographers.
They
here.
gotta earn it. That's
Just wait by a burrow.
Yes.
Just wait.
have to put the camera in the molehill.
For some of my research last summer, we used a sewer cam on burrows. And I think Jeremy tried our sewer cam too. We got a lizard. Kind of neat.
that's cool.
What is
Okay.
this?
So it's the same kind of camera a sewer plumbing inspector would use to inspect your sewer line. So you can kind of snake this camera around. You can put them in little burrows. So we were checking for tarantulas, but we found lizards and other things.
That sounds fun.
Very cool. And with that, that is going to end our show. Thank you so much for listening this week. I want to say thank you to Andreia and Becky and Sebastian for helping me out this week and talking all about wildlife photography, a topic that I don't know very well, but I got to learn a lot of cool stuff this week. We'll be back next week, I think, even though it's spring break, we're going to hopefully do a show. We'll see. If you don't hear from us for 2 weeks, then you'll know. But until then, you've been listening to That Science and Nature Show. My name is Jeremy Howard, and we're out.